Hello and welcome to this Substance training series. In these videos, I'm going to go through the process of recreating this rocky ground procedural material. In these videos, I'm going to showcase my overall workflow and how I approach creating a material such as this. I'm also going to discuss, several node combinations for creating specific effects. Before we begin, I want to give a special shout out to Nicholas Weirman. Nicholas is a tech artist and a product manager for Substance Designer. To learn how to create procedural materials such as this, I've been studying his Substance materials and I've learned a lot of valuable techniques from his work. I'd like to share what I've learned and developed through my exploration of procedural texturing. The material we are working with will be available for download for you to follow along as well. So when we look at a material like this, and we're going to be creating this completely procedural, it looks like it would be a very complex task. And if we take a look at the graph itself, you can see that we have all these nodes and the overall process looks very daunting. However, if you look at this material, if we break this down into sections and we build this node by node as we go, the overall process, when broken down into its simplest forms, it actually becomes quite manageable and a very quick process to do here in Substance Designer. My overall process for creating any texture material is again to always start with the surface detail. I take a look at the large forms, the small forms, also the small details. Once I kind of have the shape and form defined, I will then move into color and roughness variation. So let's first start this process by taking a look at the organization of the Substance package itself. So here you can see that I have my Substance package and I have three graphs. I have my stones, cracks, and pebbles. So the way I structure this, my first graph here, stones, the first graph is going to be what is opened by default when you open the package in Substance Designer. And so if you want to reorder these, you could just simply left click, drag, and just move these guys and place them in any order. So for instance, stones is going to become the main graph. So that's what we're going to be working towards here. And like I said earlier, this can look pretty complex as we go. So one of the workflows that I use is that I try to take portions of a graph of something that I can reuse, something that I can basically simplify down to a single node, and I will do that. I'll take those nodes and I will just place those into a new graph. And that's what I have here. I have a cracks and I have a pebbles. So for instance, if we take a look at the cracks, let me just open this up. Here you can just see quickly I have several nodes here that are creating our crack patterns. So we have these two different distinct patterns. So we have this pattern here and this pattern. And that's what this graph here does. Now, if I had all these nodes, and in this case it's not a lot, but let's take a look at this. If I go to my stones here and we go back to the very beginning of my graph here, and you can see that here is the node where I'm utilizing these cracks. Now let's just say I had all these nodes out here. Now what I'm actually doing with this cracks, let me just kind of maximize here my my graph view so we can see this a bit better. You can see that I'm actually using three instances of this to vary this effect. And if I were to have, that node structure here, and let's say I want to do different variations, I would have had to have, copy and pasted that node structure, three different times. So here you can see how much more complex that graph setup's going to get. So the more nodes I have, the more I have to keep track of, and so on. How also, since this is something, this crack pattern is something that I want to kind of have variation to, what I did was and since it was a very vital portion of this project, like I said, being able to instance that, so we have our cracks graph. Within this graph, I gave myself a bunch of little user parameters here. So when I want to just instance a version of this this cracks here, I can tweak the parameters. I can just simply create a new instance. So here you can see that this is the instance we get. Just make a new instance here of this graph, and now you can see that just by tweaking a few of the parameters that I exposed, I get a different variation of that, and it makes it much more easy to work with just a single node than if I were to have all of those nodes pasted here, and I'm switching different parameters on nodes and so on, to get this effect to work. So in my case, it's just much more simple to do this, which is to take those group of nodes and just compile them down to a single node as I've done here. Now that's something, like I said, I'll do often. Now in the case of this stones material, I've done this twice, so I've got cracks and then also have pebbles here. So one thing I want to also talk about with the management of these graphs. So like I said, this stones graph here, this is my main graph. So if my overall goal is to be able to take this material and utilize this, let's say in a host application, maybe it's a game engine like Unreal Engine or Unity. And so this is going to be the only material I create. Well, if I publish a Substance material, all of the graphs that are inside of this Substance package, they're going to become their own material. So if I were to take this inside of, let's say, UE4, you would have a stones material, a cracks material, and a pebbles material. Now, that's not really what I want, and it gives me more I have to manage inside my host application. For instance, the only material that I actually have in this process or in this package here is really just the stones material. The cracks and the pebbles are just helper graphs. So what I'll do is I'll select the graph. This is going to be my main material, and it depends on your workflow. You could have more than one main material if you want. If you have the graph selected and you come over here to your attributes, there is a setting here called output computation. And by default, every graph you create, the output computation is set to true or yes. Now, if you have a graph that you don't want to output, such as this cracks and this pebbles, again, these are just kind of helper graphs that are, helping me to basically, composite or create this stones material. So I'll go to my cracks and notice again here I've got output computation is set to no, and the same thing with my pebbles. So output computation is set to no. What that means is that when I publish this substance, the cracks and the pebbles will not be shown inside of the substance material. We won't see them. So when I open these up, let's say in Unreal Engine or Unity, I would have my substance and I would only have this single stones material. Cracks and pebbles graphs would not be there. However, they're still being utilized within this stone graph. So they're not going to be, basically their output won't be computed. Which is very helpful. And that's just a way that I organize my graphs. So I'll have a lot of these kind of helper nodes or base material nodes, things that I'm not really ever going to use in my host app. And if that's the case, I just set the output computation to no. So now that we've kind of discussed, this overall kind of package organization, let's jump in and take a look at what we're going to do with this graph itself. So like I said, if we take a quick overview of this, we're going to start here with a pattern. So this is going to be a pattern. This section here, all this section here that you see, let's just kind of move this over. Let me just try to select these guys here with my mouse. Here we go. So this section here, this is going to be where I start to work on my surface detail. So this is going to be the area where I create my cracked edges, my small and large shapes, basically define my overall shape and form. Once we have that, we'll then move this here into our base color. Here is where we have a section just for our roughness. Here we have our occlusion, and then here you can see that here I'll just kind of select these two areas here. This is just basically my height and normal, and this middle section here is where I'm working on some different things for the water. So I have some different water masks, moss mat, and so on. And so you can see that, if we look at this in these different sections, and the way that I kind of worked with this was I just basically, like I said, started here with my overall shape and form, and then, once I had that, I started to work on my roughness. Roughness is always second for me because I think it's very important to get the surface's interaction with light. How that's going to work. If you can get that nailed down, it makes authoring the base color here much more simple. And so, that's the kind of the overall process with that. So like I said, the first thing that we're going to start on that's really going to kind of drive most of this entire effect here is going to be our pattern. So as you can see, we have just this single pattern node. Now let's dive in here into our first graph. This is going to be our cracks, and let's take a look at how this pattern was created. So here you can see that in our 2D output here we have some cracks here, but these cracks also define the overall pattern of the stone. So really this is kind of cracks and a stone pattern that we're going to be working on. And so to create this pattern here, I'm utilizing a couple of new nodes that are in Substance Designer 5. So I'm going to be utilizing the distance node, and then here you can see that I'm utilizing the edge detect node. So let's take a look at how this works. The first thing that I do again, I'm always constantly trying to think about breaking down what I want to do into its simplest form first. So get as simple as you can and then build complexity on top of that. And when you kind of work that way, there's really nothing you can't handle. I mean, there's nothing going to be too complex because it doesn't matter how crazy it looks. If you take it down to its simplest form and work your way up, you can make it through anything. And so, here's just another illustrative example of how I kind of do that. So I want to go with this pattern here. This is what I'm trying to create. Well, in order to create this pattern, I need just some very simple shapes. Okay, so to do that, we have a great node here called the tile random. And so here in your library, you can find, a host of nodes that you're going to use. And if you're kind of new to Substance Designer, one thing I'll kind of just point out, if you hit the space bar, here you can see that we get these operational nodes. These are kind of like core nodes that you're going to use often. Things like levels, things like, blending, so that's compositing one image over top of another, hue, saturation, lightness nodes, transformation, and so on, uniform colors and warps, just basic kind of nodes that you'll use throughout the process. Again, I like to call those my operational nodes. Here in the library is where we have a lot of other kind of complex nodes, and everything's kind of grouped here. So we have things like noises and patterns. Here's transforms. We also have effects. Here's our filters if you need to get to your adjustments, blurs, and so on. So we have all these nodes. One thing that I use often, instead of trying to just go through these different categories, is I'll just use the search function. So for instance, I'll just start to type in tile, and let's see what tile comes up here. Oh, okay, so I've got several of these tiling nodes. Here's the tile random that I want to utilize. So if we take a look at the tile random node, I'll just double click here to view this into my 2D view. You can see that we get just some random shapes. So what I did was I just came over here to the tile random. I came over here to, let's see, my actual shape that I want to use. We go to the pattern, and we have a host of these different patterns. I chose this disc pattern, and here I've got an X and a Y amount. You'll notice here that I've actually exposed these parameters. So this is going to be, like I showed you previously when I instanced this node, there was a lot of parameters that were available to me to tweak. That means that it made it very easy for me to, complete, if I change my pattern, the pattern driving everything else in this stone graph. So a simple change of these parameters will give me a completely different stone pattern. And so that's why I have these exposed. But the idea again here was just to take just some very simple shapes, in my case a disc, and just kind of just randomly place these, or kind of almost like splatter these here on the image. We also have a node that's pretty good for this too, called splatter. So if you need to use this, we've got the splatter here. This is gray, and then we have splatter color and so on. In my case, I just used the tile random to kind of get this pattern. Now you'll notice that there's also some variance of color in this. So if we zoom in, you can see that, well, okay, this disc here is very white, and this one here is kind of dark. So it almost kind of looks like a height, kind of like a height information here. So white being kind of close, and these dark values kind of pushing back in Z space, so to speak. So we got this luminance that's actually controlled. If I zoom down here or scroll down here on the slider, you can see that we have this color random. It's set to 1, so we're randomizing these values. If we set this guy all the way to 0, you can see that we get basically this binary white and black here for these shapes. So I wanted this random all the way up because we're going to need that with our distance node to create the variation in the pattern that we have here. So the idea again is just to start with just some simple shapes that are just randomly placed here on our canvas. Alright, and then I want to just utilize the distance node to create this Voronoi pattern here. So this is a pattern that's found quite often in nature, and it's really good. It's got a lot of use in environment texturing. And so this distance node here we can find here on our operational node. So I hit the space bar, and here is the distance node. So we bring this guy in. It's part of Substance Designer 5. And so what it does is it takes two inputs, a mask and a source. So here's my source. Again, I'm starting really simple, just some simple, kind of, disc shapes just randomly placed here in my canvas. And I'm feeding that here into the distance node. Here I have a levels, and now I'm using this levels here because I need to give this a mask input. And like I said before, I wanted to vary this color so I could get, some variation here in this shape. In order to just kind of take this and create a mask, I just took levels here and just took my input white and just crushed it all the way down to get this kind of binary mask, and just feed this into the mask input. So once I have this in place, you can see here's my distance parameter here. If I just if I move this guy all the way down to 0, it looks just like the source input. And as we start to increase our max distance, you can see that we're starting to just kind of create a pattern here, and we just pull this guy all the way up, and it's a really quick way of creating kind of this Voronoi pattern, something that we'll use often in kind of natural environment type texture things like that, especially like stone and little stone patterns and stuff. Okay, so we have this guy, and you can see that it also has some of this variation here. One thing I'll point out is that you have an option for combine source and distance. I want to make sure that I use only the source. I don't want to combine this. So see, if I combine this here, you can see that it's taking, well, it's giving me a different effect altogether, which, I could use this if we want. But in my case, I just want this flat pattern, so I'm only going to use this as source. So the next thing I want to do is I want to have this pattern, but I want to be able to take this pattern and I want to get the edges of everything, okay, on this pattern. And we can do that very quickly with the edge detect node. Now, the edge detect node, we can find that here in our library. So if I just start to type in edge, you can see here we have edge detect. Here you'll notice on this node that I have a couple of these parameters exposed, so I can't really mess with them. So let's just take this edge detect and let's just throw this here into our graph. And let's just take this input here. Here's another a quick tip for this. Sometimes notice you're always thinking about, well, okay, I've got to go from output to input, but we can also go the other way too. So if I want to make this connection, I could just take this guy from its input and just plug it in here as well. So now we have our edge detect. If I zoom in on this guy here, you can see that I can adjust the edge width as well as the roundness. All right, so you can see that with my node, I went in and I just exposed this edge width and this edge roundness. Now this lets me just have a little bit of control when I instance this graph into the stones, the main material, give me a little bit of control in how I kind of create this crack pattern here. All right, so we don't need this node. Let's just delete it. So here's our edge detect. So if we kind of zoom in on this edge detect node, you can see that, well, yes, it did create some lines. So like I said, going back to that whole thinking about, building this up node by node, starting simple and so on. So here you can see that, we started with this very simple shape. Then we created this pattern from that shape. Now we're going to take this pattern and create some lines. So now we have some lines. Okay, and they kind of have a little bit of curve and things like that to them, and that's all good. And we can see that kind of in this, it kind of gives us the cracks are basically the negative space, and in this white space here, we can see how this would make a nice stone pattern. However, if we take a look at our lines, they're somewhat uniform, kind of straight. There's no real chaos to it or variation or whatsoever. So this doesn't really look like something that would be super useful. So what we would want to do at this point is then kind of warp this. So now I have this warp node here. Let me show you how that works. So if I hit the space bar, this is going to be an operational node. So here's just a warp. All right, and we're going to take this guy, and I'm going to take my distance here, and my edge detect. I'm going to plug this into my input. Now I need a gradient input for this. And so here is where I have this noise, this purlin noise. If we come over here to our noises, we have a whole host of noises that you can use in here, and you can get so many different variations of these effects by just depending on what kind of noise that you use. In my case, I wanted to use this purlin noise, and the reason being is because if we kind of look at this guy in kind of an abstract way, you can see that again we kind of have some kind of height information, the white being kind of raised, and if we kind of look at how this kind of slopes down into these darker regions like this. But notice how this is kind of gives us kind of a lot of these kind of rounded shapes to this. So here you can see a lot of these kind of rounded shapes. And that'll be pretty good if we take this guy. Again, here we'll just take our output and we'll plug this into our gradient input. Now when we look at this by default, it's way too intense. That's no problem. We have an intensity slider. So if I just kind of pull this value down and just kind of warp it a little bit, you can see that's what I'm doing. I'm just kind of warping these lines. Again, just building this effect up as I go, little by little. So here we have lines, and the next step here is we just make a little bit of warp in the lines. It's all about creating variation. So now we have this warp in the lines. So the next step is, again, taking this stepped approach. The next step is we take a look at our lines, and if I zoom in really close, I have some nice warped lines, but one thing that's kind of going on here that I don't like is that when I look at this line here, it's pretty aliased here, okay? And it's really thin, and it's got this kind of nasty aliased effect going on here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to soften this up, and I'm going to utilize this kind of blur high quality grayscale. So if I just double click this node, you can see the difference. So we go from this kind of alias line to this nice kind of smoother line. We lose a little bit of value, but we get more of this kind of cleaner looking line. So just a really quick thought here on this blur. If we hit this space bar here and we go to our blur, we look at our operational nodes and you'll see, well, we have a blur. Why didn't I use this? The reason I didn't use this blur is because, well, this blur is not as good. It's kind of a low quality blur, and this is a high quality blur. The reason why we have a low quality blur is because this is a lot less expensive computationally. If you're building a substance that you're going to use in a runtime engine, you have to kind of think about, you know, the how expensive a certain node is going to be. So for instance, you know, if I want to create a substance that's going to that I want to be able to regenerate pretty quick inside the runtime engine, then I'm going to want to try to use you know, the least amount of nodes or least amount of operations as possible to do that. And utilizing something like this blur high quality, and where I get this is if I just come over here to my filters, you can see I've got a blurs category, and that's where we find these extra blurs here. And you know, if I utilize this blur high quality, I'm going to get a better look, but it's also going to be a bit more expensive to that. And we also have a quality setting to this as well. Okay, so I use this blur to kind of, you know, get a little bit more of an anti-alias line, but like I said, we start to lose a little bit of the value to this. So notice here this line is not as dark as this line. So a way to fix that would be to just kind of multiply, you know, what we've done here over top of itself. So here I used a blend. So just grabbed a blend, set its mode to multiply, and just multiplied, you know, this blur over top of itself. And now we get this line. So now we get a nice kind of thick anti-alias line here. So this is what we had before, kind of crunchy, doesn't look too good. And now we have this. This is going to be a lot better for us. And this is kind of a technique that I use often when I need to create a line. So if I create a line using like an edge detect or something like that, and it looks kind of, you know, real crunchy like this, I'll then blur it and then multiply it over top of itself to get, you know, kind of a thicker, more anti-aliased line. And then finally, I'm just going to output this as a mask. So the reason I'm doing that is because, you know, like I said, this is just kind of like a helper node here, this cracks. I'm going to just use this as a pattern. And if I just hit my space bar and I come over here to my outputs, I can add any number of outputs I want into a graph. I don't have to just use the outputs that are given to me by the new substance template or anything. But in my case, I just use mask because in this case, I'm only going to be outputting this grayscale information. There's no reason to add this as base color or diffuse because number one, it has nothing to do with those channels. And number two, it's just easier to output this kind of gray value here. So I'll just set this usage here to mask, and you can see that we have this mask usage here. So that's why I did that. And then finally, I did the same thing here with this pattern because as you'll see when we start to get into the stones graph itself, we're going to utilize this pattern as well. So we're going to utilize our cracks here, and we're going to utilize this pattern. Now, we've processed the cracks a bit. So remember, we've warped them and done some things to them. So if we look at kind of the cracks with this warped kind of lines here, they're no longer going to match up with the original pattern. And so to fix that, what I needed to do was just grab the warp, just copy paste it, and just, you know, warp the same, use the same warp setting here to warp this pattern. Again, it's being driven by that same noise. And so now we have the warp of the lines and the warp of the pattern. When we overlay these two guys together, they'll match up. And so then I took this pattern and just set another output. Again, its usage is set to mask so that I can use these guys. So now I have two outputs, a cracks and a pattern. Then, like I said, I wanted to be able to kind of vary this guy up here a bit, so I went in and just exposed a lot of these parameters like intensity and so on. If I just double click out here in an empty spot on my graph and I come over here to my input parameters, here's all the input parameters. Another trick is that if we come all the way over here to these buttons and I click this button here, this allows me to switch to preview mode. I can actually view these parameters using the actual kind of GUI controls that you would actually see when this graph is instanced. And so when you're kind of working on your substances and you're kind of trying out some values, I always just click onto these GUI instances just because it's easier to work with than this mode here where we have to drop this down and tweak this default setting and all that kind of stuff. So again, that's kind of a handy thing. Something else, if you want to kind of see some of these parameters that I've exposed here, sometimes, which I'm kind of doing now, is I'm looking at some of these values. I don't really remember which one of these I exposed here. So one of the things I can do is I can come over here to this kind of magnifying glass guy here, and I can do a search. And so I can search by node types, or I can come over and search by my custom parameters. So if I drop this down, this is going to show all the custom parameters that are available to me that I've exposed to that root level of the graph. So if I just move this guy down here to shape rotation, you can see that it kind of grays out all the nodes, and then it highlights the node where this input parameter was exposed from. So now I can come over to my tile random, and I can see that, oh yes, here is my shape rotation here that I wanted to look at. Yes, it's been exposed here. So like I said, I just went through some of these nodes and just exposed some things like my size, my random x and y size, my amounts, my intensity here for my warps, and so on, so that when I instance this cracks into my stones, I can create these different variations of this pattern very quickly. So now what we'll do, let's just save what I have here so far, and let's just jump back over here to our stones graph, and again just take a look at what we have. So here we have our pattern, and like I said, I just took this graph, this cracks to start, just left click, drag and drop, and place this guy here. And if we take a look, you can see that here's my outputs. I've got my cracks and I've got my pattern. And then I made 3 instances of this. So here's the first instance, here's the second one, and you can see where I just went through some of my controls and just varied it up to get a different pattern. And then the same thing with this guy down here. You can see he gets a different pattern altogether. So the lines are a bit more, have a bit more chaos to them. They're a bit more warped and so on. So the idea here is that I'm taking this pattern, just kind of varying it up quite a bit. And that's another tip that I'll have, and you'll see this as a common theme as I start to work through this material, is that I try to, with any procedural, or just really texturing in general, but it really comes into play a lot with procedural, because when you create a procedural material, well, it kind of has a pretty good chance of looking procedural. And so, the way to combat that is I go through the process of just constantly just layering variation. It's all about layering variation as much as possible. So we have a pattern. This is kind of a cool pattern. We could just use this. Or we could take this pattern, we could change it to get this pattern. We can change it again to get this pattern. And then we can take all 3 of these patterns and layer them together to get an even better variation of this. So like I said, when you want to create a material and you want to have it look good, and you want to have it not look, oh well, that's just a procedural texture. It all comes down to just layering variation.